Have you ever felt a shiver down your spine? A moment of deja vu so strong, it feels like a memory of the future. Humans have been obsessed with predicting what's next since we first looked at the stars. We've turned to oracles, prophets, and mystics, all promising a glimpse behind the curtain of time. Most of it is nonsense, easily dismissed. But sometimes, just sometimes, a prediction lines up with reality so perfectly it makes you stop and wonder. Are we just good at finding patterns in chaos? Or something else going on? We're talking about prophecies written centuries, even millennia ago, that seem to describe specific world-changing events with chilling accuracy. From the fall of empires to the rise of terrifying leaders, these ancient words echo through history. They force us to ask a simple, unsettling question: how did they know? Number 17. How could a vague warning topple an entire kingdom? Let's start in the ancient world, with a king who had everything. His name was Croesus, and he was the king of Lydia, in modern-day Turkey, around 560 BCE. His wealth was so legendary that we still use the phrase "as rich as Croesus." He controlled a powerful empire, and he was getting ambitious. He had his eyes on the neighboring Persian Empire, led by an up-and-coming ruler named Cyrus the Great. But attacking an empire is a big deal. Croesus wanted to be sure. So he decided to consult the most famous source of wisdom in the ancient world, the Oracle of Delphi. The Oracle of Delphi wasn't a person. It was a place, a holy sanctuary dedicated to the god Apollo. There, a priestess known as the Pythia would enter a trance, supposedly inhaling sacred vapors from a crack in the earth, and speak words believed to come directly from Apollo himself. But Croesus was a smart man. He wasn't going to trust just any fortune teller. First, he devised a test, and he sent messengers to 7 of the most famous oracles of his time. He told them that on the 100th day after they left his capital, they were to ask their oracle what King Croesus was doing at that exact moment. He then did something he thought no one could possibly guess. He took a lamb and a tortoise, chopped them up, and boiled them together in a bronze cauldron with a bronze lid. When the messengers returned, most of the answers were nonsense, but the messenger from Delphi came back with a poetic verse that described exactly what he had done. The Pythia had said, "I know the number of the grains of sand and the measures of the sea. I understand the dumb, and I hear the man who does not speak. The smell has come to my senses of a hard-shelled tortoise boiling in bronze together with the flesh of a lamb." Croesus was stunned. This was it. The Oracle of Delphi was the real deal. Now convinced of the oracle's power, he sent magnificent gifts and asked the question that was really on his mind: should I go to war with Persia? The oracle's answer is one of the most famous and infamous prophecies in history. The Pythia told him, if Croesus crosses the Halys River, a great empire will be destroyed. That was all he needed to hear. A great empire will be destroyed. Obviously, she meant the Persian Empire. He gathered his armies, allied himself with other Greek states, and marched confidently across the Halys River to attack Cyrus the Great. The war was a disaster, the Lydian army was defeated, their capital city was captured, and Croesus himself was taken prisoner. As he stood waiting to be burned on a pyre by the victorious Cyrus, he finally understood the oracle's prophecy. A great empire had indeed been destroyed, his own. So, did the Oracle of Delphi genuinely see the future? The Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote down this story in his book, The Histories, about a century later, certainly presented it that way. For him, it was a tale about hubris and the inescapable nature of fate. But there's a more cynical and perhaps more realistic way to look at it. The priests at Delphi were not just religious figures, they were politically savvy operators. Delphi was a hub of information with visitors from all over the known world. They likely had a better intelligence network than any single king. They would have known that the Persian Empire under Cyrus was a rising, formidable power. And the prophecy itself is a masterpiece of ambiguity. It's a classic psychic hedge. No matter who won the war, the oracle would be correct. If Croesus had won, the priests would have celebrated their correct prediction of Persia's downfall. Since he lost, they could say, we told you a great empire would fall. We never said which one. It was a win-win for Delphi. They couldn't be wrong. It was a brilliant strategy that ensured their reputation, and their income from wealthy patrons like Croesus remained secure for centuries. The story of Croesus became a cautionary tale, but it was also the greatest advertisement the oracle could have asked for. What we still don't know was the Pythia's trance a genuine psychic state, a product of hallucinogenic gases or just clever theater? How many of the oracle's prophecies were completely wrong, and we just don't hear about them because they were never recorded? And did the priests of Delphi ever use their influence to deliberately manipulate political events, or were they just masters of saying nothing while sounding profound? Number 16, could a monk's vision foresee a city built on sand? Imagine a city that shouldn't exist, a place built on 118 small islands in a marshy lagoon held up by millions of wooden stakes driven into the mud. This is Venice. For centuries, it was a major financial and maritime power, a bridge between East and West. But according to one strange legend, its rise and even its eventual struggles were foretold by a medieval monk long before it became the floating city we know today. The prophecy is attributed to Saint Malachy, an Irish archbishop who lived in the 12th century. He's most famous for another prophecy we'll get to later about the popes, but a lesser-known vision of his supposedly described the future of a great city. The legend states that during a visit to Rome, Malachy had a series of visions. In one, he saw a future where people would flee from a mainland ravaged by invaders. They would seek refuge in the muddy islands of the lagoon and build a powerful republic there, a city of the sea. He saw it becoming incredibly wealthy through trade, its ships dominating the Mediterranean. But he also saw its decline, predicting it would one day face threats not from armies, but from the very waters that sustained it. Now let's look at the history of Venice. The city's origins are complex, but its growth truly exploded after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And from the 5th century onwards, people from the Italian mainland, fleeing invasions by Germanic tribes like the Lombards and later the Huns, sought safety in the hard-to-reach islands of the Venetian lagoon. Just as the vision described, they started as a collection of refugee settlements and slowly coalesced into a unified city. By the High Middle Ages, around Malachy's time, and in the centuries that followed, Venice had become a maritime superpower. The Republic of Venice controlled a vast network of trade routes. Its fleets were legendary. It was the launching point for the Fourth Crusade in 1204, an event that led to the sacking of Constantinople and cemented Venice's economic dominance. The city became fabulously wealthy, a center of art, culture, and commerce. This perfectly matches the part of the prophecy about a powerful, rich republic built by refugees. And what about the final part, the threat from the water? Today, Venice's greatest enemy is the sea. The city is sinking, a phenomenon known as subsidence, while sea levels are rising due to climate change. The regular flooding, called acqua alta, has become more frequent and more severe, threatening the foundations of its ancient buildings and its very existence. The city that was born from the water is now in a constant battle against it. The problem with this prophecy is its source. Unlike Malachy's prophecy of the popes, which was published in 1595, the prophecy about Venice is much more folkloric. It's hard to find a primary source document from the 12th century that contains it. The story seems to have emerged much later, passed down through tradition. This makes it a classic case of a story potentially being shaped after the events happened. It's easy to look back at the history of Venice and create a prophecy that fits it perfectly. Skeptics would argue that it's not a real prophecy at all, but a legend created to give Venice a more mystical origin story. It's also not a huge leap of logic for someone in the Middle Ages to see a settlement in a lagoon and predict it might have problems with water someday. The details, however, about refugees from the mainland forming a powerful republic are what give the legend its power. Whether it was a genuine vision or a story created after the fact, it captures the incredible, improbable history of Venice with an eerie resonance. What we still don't know, did Saint Malachy ever actually have a vision about Venice, or was his name simply attached to a popular local legend centuries later? How did a collection of disparate refugees manage to organize themselves into one of the most stable and long-lasting republics in history? And can modern technology save Venice from the watery fate the prophecy hints at? Or is the city's long story finally coming to an end? Number 15 was the fate of a nation written in a child's dream. The rise of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century was like a force of nature. In a few short decades, a group of nomadic tribes from the steppes of Central Asia, united under a single leader, created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. That leader was Genghis Khan. His story is one of brutal conquest, but also of incredible vision and organization. And according to the Mongols' own historical texts, his destiny was known before he even began. The primary source for this is The Secret History of the Mongols, an epic poem written for the Mongol royal family shortly after Genghis Khan's death. It's part history, part mythology. It tells the story of Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan. In one section, the book describes the visions and prophecies surrounding his rise. It speaks of his ancestor, a mythical blue-gray wolf, and a divine mandate from the eternal blue sky, the supreme deity of the Mongol people. One of the most specific prophetic moments described in the text comes from a clan chieftain named Togrul, also known as Wang Khan. He was a powerful leader of the Krait tribe and an early ally and later rival of the young Temujin. According to the secret history, Togrul had a dream. In the dream, a man of fire appeared and told him that the boy Temujin was destined to unite all the tribes of the steppe and rule over them. The man of fire warned Togrul to aid the boy, for his destiny was willed by the heavens. Another account describes how a shaman, or holy man, declared that the eternal sky had decreed that Temujin would be the ruler of the world. He was given the title Genghis Khan, which is often translated as oceanic ruler or universal ruler, signifying a dominion that would be as vast as the ocean. These prophecies weren't just vague pronouncements, they served a crucial political purpose. They acted as a divine justification for Genghis Khan's ambition, and what followed was a stunning fulfillment of that ambition. Starting in 1206, when he was officially proclaimed leader of all Mongols, Genghis Khan launched a series of campaigns that would change the world. He conquered the Xia and Jin dynasties in northern China. He swept across Central Asia, destroying powerful empires like the Khwarezmian Empire. His armies were disciplined, his tactics were innovative, and his rule was often brutal. By the time of his death in 1227, he had laid the groundwork for an empire that would stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe. His sons and grandsons, like Ogedei and Kublai Khan, would continue his conquests, pushing the empire to its maximum extent. A boy from a fractured nomadic society had, against all odds, become the universal ruler. Of course, we have to look at this critically. The Secret History of the Mongols was official state propaganda. It was written by the victors to legitimize their rule. It's highly likely that these prophecies were either invented after the fact or greatly exaggerated to make Genghis Khan's rise seem inevitable and divinely ordained. Giving a leader a destiny is a powerful way to ensure loyalty and discourage rebellion. Who would dare stand against a man chosen by the eternal sky? Even if the prophecies were created later, they show how important the idea of a foretold destiny was to the Mongols themselves. Well, they believed they were fulfilling a heavenly mission. This belief likely gave their soldiers a powerful sense of purpose and morale. Whether the prophecies were real or not, they became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By believing in Genghis Khan's destiny, his followers helped to make it happen. Were these stories of visions and shamans completely fabricated for the secret history, or were there real prophetic traditions among the Mongol tribes that we've lost? How much of Genghis Khan's success was due to his own genius versus the powerful ideology of divine mandate that he and his followers embraced? And if a leader believes they have a divine right to rule the world, does that inevitably lead to the kind of brutal conquest the Mongols unleashed? Number 14, could an Egyptian priest see his country's collapse a century away? For ancient Egypt is often seen as a monolithic, stable civilization that lasted for 3,000 years. But the truth is, its history was punctuated by periods of chaos, civil war, and collapse. These were known as the intermediate periods. One of the most striking pieces of literature from this civilization is a text that seems to predict one of these collapses with haunting detail. It's called the Prophecy of Neferti. The text is set in the court of King Sneferu, a pharaoh of the Old Kingdom who reigned around 2600 BCE. The king is bored and asks for some entertainment. A lector, priest, and sage named Neferti is brought before him. Instead of telling a simple story, Neferti asks the king if he wants to hear about the past or the future. Sneferu, intrigued, asks for the future. What follows is not a happy prediction. Neferti describes a terrible time to come for Egypt. He paints a picture of complete societal breakdown. The social order will be turned upside down. The poor of the land will become rich. A man will regard his son as his enemy. The natural world will be in chaos. The river of Egypt is empty. The land is destroyed. He speaks of foreign invaders from the east, Asiatics, who will overrun the country. He says, I show you the land in turmoil. All is ruin. It's a vision of total collapse, a dark age where everything the Egyptians hold dear is destroyed. But then, the prophecy offers a glimmer of hope. Neferti predicts that a king will come from the south, named Ameni. He will wear the white crown of Upper Egypt, then take the red crown of Lower Egypt, unifying the two lands. He will drive out the Asiatics, restore order Ma'at, and build a great wall to keep the invaders out forever. This Ameni will be a savior, a restorer of the nation. Here's where it gets interesting. While the story is set in the Old Kingdom, scholars are almost certain that the Prophecy of Neferti was actually written much later, during the Middle Kingdom, specifically during the reign of a pharaoh named Amenemhat I around 1991 BCE. And Ameni is a well-known short form of the name Amenemhat. The prophecy describes with great accuracy the historical period that happened between the Old and Middle Kingdoms, the First Intermediate Period. This was a time of political fragmentation, civil war, and economic decline in Egypt. There were indeed incursions from Asiatics from the Sinai Peninsula. The fulfillment of the prophecy is the rise of Amenemhat I himself. He was a vizier who took the throne and founded Egypt's powerful 12th dynasty. He came from the south, as the prophecy said. He reunited the country after a period of instability. He fought against Asiatic incursions and initiated the construction of a series of fortifications in the eastern delta known as the Walls of the Ruler. He was the savior king Neferti had predicted. So this isn't a case of someone seeing the future centuries away. It's something more subtle and, in a way, more clever. It's a piece of political propaganda written to look like an ancient prophecy. By creating a text that predicts the chaos of the First Intermediate Period and the rise of a savior king named Ameni, the court of Amenemhat, I was creating a powerful piece of legitimization for his rule. They were essentially saying, look, this wise man from the golden age of Sneferu predicted our king's arrival. His reign is not an accident, it is the fulfillment of destiny. It's an example of a post-eventum prophecy, a prophecy written after the events it describes. But it's so skillfully done, framing recent history as a foretold future, that it gives us a fascinating look into the Egyptian mindset. They believed in a cyclical history of chaos and order, and this text used that belief to cement a new pharaoh's power. It was less about predicting the future and more about shaping the present by rewriting the past. What we still don't know how common was this practice of creating prophecies after the fact to support a ruler. Are there other ancient texts that we take as genuine predictions, but are actually sophisticated political tools? And did the average Egyptian who heard this story believe it was an ancient prophecy, or was there a widespread understanding that it was a clever piece of royal marketing? For number 13, did a Scottish seer predict a family's end by a mute's hand? Let's move to the misty highlands of 17th century Scotland. Here we meet a figure shrouded in folklore, a man known as the Brehon Seer. His real name was supposedly Kenneth Mackenzie, and he was said to possess the second sight, the ability to see future events. He worked as a farm laborer on the Brehon estate, home to the powerful Earls of Seaforth, chieftains of the Mackenzie clan. Many predictions are attributed to him, but the most famous and detailed is the one that foretold the doom of the Seaforth family line. The story goes that the Countess of Seaforth Isabella was feeling insecure while her husband, the third Earl, was away in Paris. She summoned the seer and demanded to know what her husband was doing. Kenneth Mackenzie was reluctant, but the Countess insisted. He looked into his seeing stone and told her the truth. He saw the Earl in a grand room in Paris, on his knees before a beautiful lady, with his arm around her waist. He was not behaving as a loyal husband should. The Countess was enraged, but her fury was not directed at her unfaithful husband, it was directed at the messenger. She accused the seer of slandering her husband's good name. In her rage, she ordered him to be executed. The method was horrific. He was to be thrown headfirst into a barrel of boiling tar. Before his execution, Mackenzie uttered a final terrible prophecy against the House of Seaforth. He declared that the last of the Seaforth Mackenzie line would be a man who would be deaf and mute. He would father 4 sons, and all 4 would die before him. He would inherit the title and estates, but would live long enough to see his line extinguished and his lands passed to a white coiffed lassie from the east. As a final sign that his prophecy was true, he said that when this last chief died, a mute carpenter would be his heir. After delivering this curse, he was executed. For over a century, the prophecy was remembered as a local legend. The Seaforths continued to be powerful nobles. But then, In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the curse began to unfold with chilling precision. The man who would become the last Lord Seaforth was Francis Humberston Mackenzie. As a young man, he suffered a severe bout of scarlet fever which left him completely deaf and almost entirely mute. He could make some sounds, but could not speak. Despite his disabilities, he was a brilliant and respected man. He married and he had 4 healthy sons. The prophecy seemed destined to fail. But then tragedy struck. One by one, his sons died. The eldest, William, died in 1800. The second, George, in 1813. The third, Francis, also in 1813. The youngest and last surviving son, a naval officer, died of a fever in 1814. Francis Humberston Mackenzie, the deaf and mute chief, had outlived all of his male heirs. He died a year later, in 1815. The direct male line of the Seaforth Mackenzies was extinct. The title died with him, and what of the estate? It passed to his eldest daughter, Mary. She was a widow, and she had just returned from living in India. She was the white, coiffed lassie from the east, the coif referring to a widow's cap. And the final, bizarre detail. The man who was next in line to inherit what was left of the Mackenzie chiefdom, a distant cousin, was indeed a carpenter who was known to be a man of few words, described by some as mute in character. The prophecy in all its specific gruesome detail had come true. The story was documented by Sir Walter Scott and other 19th century writers who were fascinated by Highland folklore. The skepticism here is strong. The first written accounts of the prophecy only appear in the 19th century, well after the events took place. This is a huge red flag. It's very possible that a much simpler, vaguer local story about a curse was embellished and made more specific over time to fit the tragic facts of the last Lord Seaforth's life. The story of the execution by tar is also so dramatic it feels like folklore. Yet, the sheer number of specific details that lined up the deaf-mute heir, the 4 sons, their premature deaths, the daughter from the East Beast, makes it one of a kind. It strains the bounds of coincidence. What we still don't know, was there a real Kenneth Mackenzie, or is he a composite figure of various Highland seers? Did an early, simpler version of the prophecy exist before the 19th century? And if so, what did it say? And how much did the existence of the prophecy itself weigh on the minds of the last Seaforth family as they watched it unfold, one tragic death at a time? Number 12, could an indigenous prophecy predict the atomic bomb? For centuries, the Hopi people of the American Southwest have passed down a complex set of prophecies concerning the future of humanity. These are not simple predictions, but a deep spiritual worldview about cycles of time and the need for humanity to live in balance with the earth. One of the most startling aspects of their prophecies, which gained attention in the mid-20th century, seems to describe modern technology in the atomic age with shocking clarity. The Hopi prophecies speak of a series of worlds that humanity has lived through. They believe we are currently living in the 4th world, and the fate of this world depends on our choices. The prophecies warned of a time when the world would be on the brink of destruction. They foretold the coming of the Pahana, the true white brother, who would return to usher in an age of peace. But before his return, a series of signs would appear. Many of these signs are strikingly specific. One prophecy stated that the land would be crossed by ribbons of iron, railroad tracks. Another mentioned people speaking through a cobweb in the air telegraph lines. But the most chilling predictions relate to the 2 world wars and the atomic bomb. The Hopi elders spoke of a gourd of ashes that would be invented by the white man. If this gourd of ashes was dropped from the sky, it would boil the oceans and burn the land, leaving nothing to grow for many years. This is an incredibly accurate description of a nuclear bomb and its radioactive fallout, spoken by a people with no concept of nuclear physics. Another prophecy detailed a sign that would appear just before this time of great destruction. It described a house of mica that would be built on the eastern shore of their land. It would be a place where the leaders of the world would gather to try, and fail, to bring peace. In 1949, a group of Hopi elders traveled from their reservation in Arizona to New York City. They stood before the newly built United Nations headquarters. Looking up at the massive glass and stone building, they identified it as the House of Mica from their prophecies. The UN was the place where world leaders gathered. Its glass walls shone like mica. For them, this was a sign that the time of the gourd of ashes was at hand. The first and second great shakings of the world, World War I and II had already occurred, and the Grid of Ashes had already been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The fulfillment seems clear to those who believe. The Guard of Ashes is a near-perfect metaphor for the mushroom cloud and devastating power of an atomic bomb. The House of Mica is a stunningly apt description of the UN building. The Hopi prophecies became more widely known after Thomas Farr Coman and others began documenting them in the 1950s, publishing them in books like The Book of the Hopi. Hopi elders like Dan Kachungva and Thomas Banyisia traveled to the UN to deliver their message of peace, warning that humanity was at a crossroads and needed to change its ways to avoid a third, final shaking. Critics, however, point out several issues. First, since Hopi tradition is oral, it is very difficult to date these prophecies precisely. It's hard to prove that the Gerd of Ashes prophecy existed in its current specific form before 1945. It's possible that ancient, vaguer warnings about destruction were reinterpreted and made more specific in light of the atomic bomb. Second, there has been some internal disagreement among different Hopi clans about the exact interpretation and even the authenticity of some of the prophecies that were shared with the outside world. Despite the skepticism, the power of the Hopi prophecies lies in their imagery. For a culture with no written language to produce a metaphor as potent as the Guard of Ashes for a technology they couldn't possibly have conceived of is, at the very least, a profound mystery. It speaks to a deep, intuitive understanding of the destructive path humanity was heading down. Well, we still don't know how old are the specific prophecies about the Gerd of Ashes and the House of Mica. Can oral traditions be preserved without alteration for centuries? And is the most important part of the Hopi message not the prediction of destruction, but the warning that we still have a choice to change our path and avoid it? In number 11, could a sleeping prophet see a Wall Street crash? His name was Edgar Cayce, but he was known as the Sleeping Prophet. He was one of the most documented psychics of the 20th century. Born in Kentucky in 1877, Cayce had a strange ability. He could put himself into a sleep-like trance and, in that state, answer questions about almost anything. He would lie on a couch, a stenographer would take down everything he said, and when he woke up, he claimed to have no memory of what he had uttered. Most of his readings, thousands of them, were about health and diagnosing illnesses for people he had never met. But occasionally he would be asked about world events and the future. In the late 1920s, America was in the middle of the Roaring Twenties. The economy was booming. The stock market seemed to be on a never-ending upward climb. Everyone was investing, many using borrowed money in a frenzy of speculation. It felt like the party would never end, but in his trance state, Edgar Cayce saw something different. On several occasions, starting as early as 1925, Cayce gave readings for clients who asked for financial advice. His warnings were consistent and dire. He spoke of a great disturbance in the financial world. In a reading from March 1929, he was asked about the stock market's short-term prospects. He warned of a great boom that would be followed by a severe downturn. He advised his clients to get out of the market. He specifically predicted a break coming that would be destructive for those who were over-leveraged and playing the market on margin. His most famous warning came on October 19, 1929. He gave a reading where he flatly stated that a crash was imminent. Just 5 days later, on October 24th, a day that would become known as Black Thursday, the market began to panic. The real crash came the following Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, or Black Tuesday. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted. Fortunes were wiped out in an instant. The great bull market was over, and the United States, along with the rest of the world, was plunged into the Great Depression, the most severe economic crisis in modern history. The fulfillment here seems undeniable. Cayce predicted a major stock market crash in 1929, and a major stock market crash happened in 1929. The transcripts of his readings exist, preserved by his Association for Research and Enlightenment, ARE, so we can see the dates and the words he used. He didn't just give a vague warning of trouble ahead, he spoke specifically about the stock market and the dangers of speculation. So what did the skeptics say? Some economists at the time, like Paul Warburg, did issue public warnings that the market was dangerously overvalued. Cayce was not the only person who was worried. However, these mainstream voices were largely ignored in the fever of the boom. The difference is that Casey wasn't an economist analyzing data. He was a man in a trance, supposedly tapping into a universal consciousness or the Akashic records. Another criticism is that, while he got the crash right, many of his other economic and geopolitical predictions were either wrong or so vague they were meaningless. For example, he predicted that China would become a Christian nation and that the lost continent of Atlantis would rise from the sea in the late 1960s. Neither of these things happened. This leads to the charge of cherry picking. Believers focus on the stunning hits, like the 1929 crash, while ignoring the many misses. It's like a broken clock that's right twice a day. The question is whether the accuracy of the 1929 prediction is so specific that it can't be dismissed as a lucky guess. You know what we still don't know? What was the source of Edgar Casey's information when he was in his trance state? Was he tapping into some unknown field of information, or was his subconscious just incredibly skilled at synthesizing information he had absorbed while awake? If his abilities were genuine, why were they so inconsistent, producing spectacular hits alongside spectacular misses? Number 10. Did a writer predict his own death by a comet? This one is less about ancient scripture and more about the uncanny intersection of a human life and a cosmic timetable. The person in question is one of America's greatest writers, Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. The celestial object is Halley's Comet, a famous comet that is visible from Earth about every 76 years. Mark Twain was born on November 30th, 1835. This was just 2 weeks after Halley's Comet had made its perihelion passage, its closest approach to the sun, making it visible in the night sky. The comet's appearance was a major astronomical event, widely reported and discussed. Twain was born under the sign of the comet, a fact that he was well aware of and that seemed to tickle his sense of cosmic irony. He lived an incredible life. He was a riverboat pilot, a prospector, a journalist, and finally, a world-famous author, creating iconic characters like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. He was a master of wit and a sharp critic of human folly. As he grew older, he became more and more interested in his own mortality and his connection to the comet that had blazed across the sky at his birth. In 1909, a year before his death, he was quoted in his biography as saying something truly remarkable. He knew the comet was due to return the following year. He said, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it. It will be the greatest disappointment of my life if I don't go out with Halley's Comet. The Almighty has said, no doubt now here are these two unaccountable freaks they came in together. They must go out together." It's a classic Mark Twain quote, witty, a bit morbid, and fatalistic. He was essentially predicting the exact timing of his own death, tying his fate to the orbit of a specific celestial body. It could have been just a bit of dark humor from an old man, but it turned out to be deadly accurate. Halley's Comet reached its perihelion on April 20th, 1910. The very next day, on April 21st, 1910, Mark Twain died of a heart attack. He was 74 years old, just as he had predicted. He came in with the comet and he went out with it. The two unaccountable freaks completed their journey together. This isn't a prophecy in the traditional sense. It wasn't a vision or a divine message. It was a personal premonition, a statement of expectation made by the man himself. There are a few ways to look at it. One is sheer coincidence. Halley's Comet has a 76-year cycle. Living to the age of 75 or 76 is not unusual. So for someone born in a comet year to die in the next comet year is statistically possible, if a bit unlikely. Another more psychological interpretation is that it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Twain was old and not in the best of health. He was also deeply affected by the deaths of his wife and two of his daughters, perhaps by fixating on the comet's return as his time to go. He willed it to be so, or at least his body gave up the fight once his self-imposed cosmic appointment had arrived. The mind has a powerful and still poorly understood influence over the body. But whatever the explanation, coincidence, psychology, or a genuine crack in the veil of time, the story remains one of the most poignant and eerie predictions ever made. The man who wrote so brilliantly about the grand, messy journey of human life seemed to know exactly when his own journey would end, tying his personal story to the silent, clockwork precision of the cosmos. What we still don't know, was Twain's prediction just a clever line he came up with, or did he have a deep, genuine feeling that his life was linked to the comet? How many other people have made similar predictions about their own deaths that did not come true and were therefore forgotten? And does a powerful belief about one's own death have the ability to influence the body's physical processes. Number 9. Was there a 120-year curse on the American presidency? This is one of the strangest and most persistent patterns in American history. It's known by several names: the Curse of Tippecanoe, Tecumseh's Curse, or the 0-Year Curse. It concerns a deadly pattern that seemed to affect American presidents who were elected in a year ending in 0 from 1840 all the way to 1960. Every single one of them died in office. The origin of the curse is rooted in a battle fought in 1811. The governor of the Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, led a force of American soldiers against a confederation of Native American tribes led by the Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, and his brother, a spiritual leader known as Tenskwatawa, or the Prophet. The battle, fought near the Prophet's settlement, was called the Battle of Tippecanoe. Harrison's forces won, burning the settlement to the ground. This victory made Harrison a national hero. According to the legend, which didn't gain wide circulation until much later, after the battle, Tenskwatawa placed a curse on Harrison and all future presidents elected in the same year as Harrison. The curse supposedly stated that Harrison would win the presidency but would die in office. And after him, every great chief chosen in a year with the same last number A, 0 year, would also die during his term. Let's look at the Eerily pattern. William Henry Harrison was elected president in 1840. He gave the longest inaugural address in history on a cold March day in 1841. He fell ill and died of pneumonia just 32 days into his term. The next 0-year election was 1860. Abraham Lincoln was elected. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in 1865, shortly into his second term. In 1880, James A. Garfield was elected. He was shot by a disgruntled office seeker in July 1881 and died from his wounds 2 months later. In 1900, William McKinley was re-elected. He was assassinated by an anarchist in September 1901. In 1920, Warren G. Harding was elected. He died of a heart attack in 1923 while on a speaking tour. In 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected for his third term. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage in April 1945, just months into his fourth term. In 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected. He was assassinated in Dallas, Texas in November 1963. 7 presidents elected in years ending in 0 over a span of 120 years. Every single one died in office. The pattern is undeniable and deeply unsettling. It became a well-known piece of American political folklore, and by the 1980 election, it was being discussed openly in the media. The curse was finally broken by the president elected in 1980, Ronald Reagan. In March 1981, just 69 days into his presidency, John Hinckley Jr. attempted to assassinate him. Reagan was shot in the chest, the bullet lodging just an inch from his heart. He was seriously wounded but survived. He went on to complete 2 full terms in office. George W. Bush, elected in 2000, also survived his 2 terms, though he did face an assassination attempt. So, was it a real curse? There's no reliable historical evidence that Tenskwatawa ever uttered these specific words. The story of the curse seems to have been created, or at least popularized in the 1930s by Robert Ripley's Believe It or Not column. It's a classic example of apophenia, the human tendency to see patterns in random data. Statistically, the presidency is a high-stress job, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, medical care was not what it is today. Plus, 4 of the deaths were assassinations, which are not random acts of nature. You could argue that the 20-year cycle is just a coincidence, a statistical anomaly that eventually ran its course. Yet, the consistency of the pattern for 120 years is what makes it so spooky. For 7 consecutive cycles, the pattern held true. That's a long time for a coincidence. What we still don't know, did the legend of the curse originate from a genuine Native American tradition, or was it entirely invented by popular media in the 20th century? Did the awareness of the curse have any psychological effect on the presidents themselves, especially Reagan, who knew he was the next in line? And is it truly just a coincidence, or is there some unexplained force or pattern at play that we don't understand? Number 8. Who wrote A List of Every Pope Until the End of Time? In 1595, a Benedictine monk named Arnold de Wyon published a history of his order. Tucked inside this large book was a strange and controversial document he attributed to a 12th century Irish saint, the Prophecy of the Popes. The saint was Malachy, the same one from the Venice legend. According to de Wyon, Malachy had a vision in Rome around the year 1139 in which he saw all the future popes until the end of time. He wrote down a short, cryptic Latin phrase for each one. This list covers 112 popes, starting with Pope Celestine II in 1143. For centuries, interpreters have tried to match Malachy's cryptic phrases to the popes who have reigned, and many of the connections are surprisingly clever, if a bit strained. For example, Pope Urban VIII, 1623 to 1644, whose family coat of arms featured 3 bees, corresponds to the motto Lilium et Rosa, the lily and the rose. This seems like a miss, but his coat of arms was from Florence, whose symbol is a lily, and he was associated with the rose of an important Catholic order. Pope Pius VI, 1775 to 1799, is described as Peregrinus Apostolicus, apostolic pilgrim. His reign was marked by extensive travels, unusual for a pope of that era, and he died in exile in France, a tragic final pilgrimage. This Pope John Paul II, 1978 to 2005, is described as de labor solis, from the labor of the sun. He was born on the day of a solar eclipse and was also entombed on the day of a solar eclipse. He was also a tremendous traveler, circling the globe like the sun. These connections often require a bit of creative thinking. But the prophecy gets truly interesting as it nears its end. The 111th pope on the list is Benedict XVI. His motto is Gloria Olivae, the glory of the olive. The Benedictine order is sometimes referred to as the Olivetans. Before he became pope, Joseph Ratzinger was a cardinal from a diocese whose coat of arms featured a Moor, often associated with olive skin. It's a stretch, but it's there. What makes people nervous is what comes next. After the 111th motto, there is only one more entry. It's not just a short phrase. It's a long apocalyptic paragraph. It describes the final pope, Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. Under his reign, the prophecy says, the city of 7 hills, Rome, will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge the people. This is meant to be the final pope, the one who will preside over the end times. So who is Peter the Roman? When Benedict XVI abdicated in 2013, the man elected to succeed him was Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who took the name Pope Francis. He is the current pope. Believers in the prophecy immediately started looking for connections. His father's name was Pietro, or Peter. His family was of Italian, or Roman, heritage. He took the name Francis after Saint Francis of Assisi, whose father was named Pietro Bernardone. The connections are there if you want to find them. This has led many to believe that Pope Francis is the final pope on Malachy's list, the one who will reign during a time of great tribulation. The scholarly consensus on this prophecy is that it is a 16th century forgery. Historians have noted that the prophecies for the popes before 1590 are very specific and accurate, often referring to family names, birthplaces, or coats of arms. But the prophecies for the popes after 1590, when the document was published, become much more vague and symbolic, like the glory of the olive. This strongly suggests that someone in the late 16th century wrote the entire list, using their knowledge of history to make the first part seem impressively accurate, in order to lend credibility to the rest. The likely motive was to influence the papal conclave of 1590 to elect a specific cardinal. Despite the strong evidence of forgery, the prophecy has had a long and powerful life. Its final, terrifying prediction keeps it in the public imagination. Every time a pope dies or resigns, the prophecy of the popes is brought up again, a 400-year-old mystery that still sparks debate and fear. What we still don't know, if it is a forgery, who was the real author and what was their exact motive? Why did Arnold de Wyon include it in his book? And regardless of its origin, is there any possibility that the creator of the list genuinely tapped into something? Or is the entire thing just a testament to human ingenuity and our desire to find meaning in cryptic clues? Number 7. How did a man named Hister become the second Antichrist? Michel de Nostradame, better known as Nostradamus, is the king of prophecies. His book, Les Prophéties, published in the 16th century, is a collection of nearly 1,000 four-line poems or quatrains. They are written in a mix of French, Latin, Greek, and Provençal. They are incredibly cryptic, filled with metaphors and anagrams. For almost 500 years, people have been trying to decipher them, claiming he predicted everything from the French Revolution to the moon landing. But one of his most famous and disturbing predictions seems to point directly to the rise of Adolf Hitler. The key quatrain is, Century 2, Quatrain 24. A common English translation reads, "Beasts ferocious with hunger will cross the rivers. The greater part of the battlefield will be against Hister. Into a cage of iron will the great one be drawn, when the child of Germany observes no law." The word that jumps out is Hister. It is strikingly close to Hitler, and the rest of the quatrain seems to fit the context of World War II. The beasts, ferocious with hunger, could be the German army. The greater part of the battlefield being against Hister fits the alliance of nations Britain, the US, the Soviet Union that formed to fight the Axis powers. The cage of iron could refer to the fall of the Nazi regime or Hitler's final days in the bunker. And the child of Germany, who observes no law, is a chillingly accurate description of Hitler and his complete disregard for international treaties and human rights. There's another quatrain, Century 5, Quatrain 29, that interpreters link to Hitler. It speaks of a man born into poverty in Western Europe, who by his tongue shall seduce a great troop, and whose fame will increase towards the realm of the East. Hitler was born into a relatively poor family in Austria, Western Europe. He was a famously charismatic orator who seduced the German people with his speeches. And his main military objective was Lebensraum, or living space, in the East, leading to the invasion of Poland and the Soviet Union. Nostradamus also wrote in his prose epistle to King Henry II that there would be 3 Antichrists. The first is generally interpreted to be Napoleon. The third is often seen as a future figure from the Middle East. But the second, he names specifically. He calls him Hister. So, is it a direct hit? Did a 16th century French astrologer predict the name and actions of the 20th century's most infamous dictator? The skeptical explanation is quite strong. Hister is not just a near anagram of Hitler. It is the classical Latin name for the lower part of the Danube River. Nostradamus was a Renaissance scholar who often used classical names and references. It's entirely possible he was simply referring to the Danube River region. The quatrain could be about a future conflict in that area. The connection to Hitler only works if you ignore the historical meaning of the word Nostradamus actually used. The other details are also vague enough to be applied to many different conflicts. Your armies crossing rivers and a leader who breaks laws are common themes throughout history. It is our modern knowledge of World War II that allows us to read those details into the quatrain. We are retrofitting the prophecy to the event. This is the primary criticism of all Nostradamus interpretations. His language is so obscure and poetic that it can be made to fit almost anything after the fact. He gives us the puzzle pieces, and we arrange them to form the picture we already have in our heads. What we still don't know, did Nostradamus intentionally use Hister as a double meaning, referring to both the river and a future leader? How much of his work was based on genuine visions versus his own projections based on the political turmoil of his own time? And is the enduring power of Nostradamus less about his ability to see the future and more about our own deep-seated need to believe that history is not random, but follows a hidden, predictable script? Number 6, could a prophecy pinpoint a revolution? 2. Centuries in advance. The French Revolution was a turning point in world history. It was a violent, chaotic, and transformative period that began in 1789. It saw the overthrow of a centuries-old monarchy, the rise of radical new ideas about liberty and human rights, and the bloody Reign of Terror. To many interpreters of Nostradamus, this society-shattering event was laid out in his quatrains more than 200 years before it happened. One of the most cited quatrains is Century 1, Quatrain 14. It reads, "From the enslaved populace, songs, chants, and demands, while princes and lords are held captive in prisons. These will in the future by headless idiots be received as divine prayers." This seems to be a remarkably direct description of the revolution. The enslaved populace rising up with songs, chants, and demands perfectly captures the spirit of the early revolution with events like the storming of the Bastille. Princes and lords held captive in prisons accurately describes the fate of King Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and much of the French aristocracy. The final 2 lines are the most chilling. The phrase "headless idiots" is often interpreted as a grim pun. The revolutionaries, after overthrowing the head of state, acted without reason, leading to the chaos of the Reign of Terror. But it could also be a literal reference to the victims of the guillotine. The idea that their downfall would be received as divine prayer speaks to the fanatical, almost religious zeal of the most radical revolutionaries, who saw the executions as a necessary cleansing of the old regime. Another quatrain, Century 9, Quatrain 20, is often linked to the flight and capture of King Louis XVI and his family. It says, "By night will come through the forest of Rhinus, two parts, a white stone, the monk in gray and Varanus. The elected capit causes tempest, fire, blood, slice." The royal family's escape attempt in 1791 took them through the forest of Rhinus. They were famously captured in the town of Varennes. Capet was the family name of the French kings, and Louis XVI was often contemptuously referred to as Citizen Capet by the revolutionaries. The tempest, fire, blood, slice is a graphic summary of the revolution and the guillotine's work. The connections seem compelling. The names of places, Varennes, the specific events, imprisonment of royalty, and the general atmosphere of populist uprising are all there. For believers, this is proof of Nostradamus' uncanny ability to see specific historical moments centuries in the future. However, the counter-arguments are the same as with all Nostradamus prophecies. The language is vague and can be interpreted in multiple ways. Reigns could mean queens as well as the forest. The monk in gray is a detail that doesn't clearly fit the historical event. The interpretation depends on selecting the quatrains that seem to fit and ignoring the hundreds that don't. Furthermore, was a revolution in France really that hard to predict? Nostradamus lived in a time of great social and religious upheaval. The tensions between the aristocracy and the common people were already ancient. A smart observer could easily predict that this tension would eventually lead to a violent tempest, fire, blood. He didn't provide a date, which makes it easy to apply his general prediction of turmoil to the most famous period of turmoil in French history. Were the place names and specific details in the quatrains just coincidences? Or did Nostradamus have access to some historical or geographical knowledge that made them seem prophetic? How many other historical events could these same quatrains be forced to fit with a little creative interpretation? And does the act of interpreting these prophecies say more about our desire for order than about the prophecies themselves? Number 5. Did a French seer predict a city's fiery doom? In September 1666, a small fire started in a baker's shop on Pudding Lane in London. In a city built largely of wood, with narrow streets and a hot, dry wind blowing, the fire spread quickly. For 4 days, it raged, consuming everything in its path. This was the Great Fire of London. It destroyed over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and St. Paul's Cathedral. It left a huge part of the medieval city in ashes. It was a catastrophe of immense proportions, and according to many, Nostradamus saw it coming. The quatrain that is always cited is Century 2, Quatrain 51. The translation is striking. "The blood of the just will commit a fault at London, burnt through lightning of 23's the 6. The ancient lady will fall from her high place. Several of the same sect will be killed." Let's break down the interpretation. The blood of the just is often taken to mean the blood of the Protestant martyrs executed under the Catholic Queen Mary, or even the blood of King Charles I, who was beheaded in 1649. The fault could be the political and religious turmoil of the time. Burnt through lightning is a poetic way of describing a massive, sudden fire. The most specific and debated part is 23's the 6. Many interpreters see this as a coded date. 23's is 20 times 3, 60. Add the 6 and you get 66. The year of the fire was 1666. This seems like an incredibly direct hit. The ancient lady will fall from her high place is seen as a reference to the iconic St. Paul's Cathedral, the ancient lady of the city whose roof collapsed and whose structure was gutted by the fire. Several of the same sect will be killed is a bit more obscure. It could refer to the handful of deaths officially attributed to the fire, or it could be a reference to the persecution of Catholics, who were wrongly blamed for starting the fire in the anti-Catholic hysteria that followed. The case seems strong, a reference to London, a fire, and what appears to be the number 66. It feels too specific to be coincidence. When you combine this with the general political and religious chaos in England at the time, it's easy to see why this quatrain is considered one of Nostradamus' greatest hits. But the skeptical view is, as always, important. First, the fire was not caused by lightning. It started in a bakery. This is a clear inaccuracy. Second, the math for 23's the 6 is highly creative. There are many other ways to interpret that phrase. It could mean 60 and 6, or it could mean something else entirely. The interpretation is forced to fit the date. And what about the blood of the just? It's a very vague phrase that could be applied to countless events in London's bloody history. Perhaps the most significant counterargument is that fires in 17th century cities were not rare. Where London was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Predicting a fire in a major city was a safe bet. The challenge is the apparent specificity of the numbers. Is it a genuine coded date, or are we just imposing a pattern on poetic nonsense because we already know the answer? The debate over this single quatrain encapsulates the entire mystery of Nostradamus. What we still don't know. Did Nostradamus have a system for coding numbers and dates, or is the 23s, the 6 calculation, just a lucky bit of creative math by interpreters? Why did he mention lightning if the fire had a mundane origin? And is it possible that the prophecy itself is less about the fire and more about the political and religious fires that were consuming England in the 17th century? Number 4, why did a man predict the temple's fall within a generation? The Second Temple in Jerusalem was the center of Jewish life and worship for centuries. Rebuilt after the return from the Babylonian exile, it was lavishly expanded by King Herod the Great, becoming one of the most magnificent structures in the Roman Empire. The Jewish historian Josephus described it in awe, covered in so much gold that it blinded you in the sunlight. To the Jewish people of the first century, it was a permanent, indestructible symbol of their covenant with God. The idea that it could be destroyed was unthinkable. Yet, a Jewish teacher from Galilee named Jesus reportedly predicted its complete and utter destruction. According to the New Testament Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus was leaving the temple complex with his disciples. They were marveling at the massive stones and beautiful buildings. Jesus turned to them and said something shocking. "Do you see all these great buildings? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." He went on to say that this destruction would happen within their own lifetime. He said, "This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." This was a radical and deeply disturbing prophecy. He was predicting the end of the world as they knew it. Let's fast forward about 40 years. The political situation in Judea had deteriorated. Decades of simmering resentment against Roman rule finally boiled over into open rebellion in the year 66 AD. This was the First Jewish-Roman War. The Roman Emperor Nero sent his best general, Vespasian, to crush the revolt. The war was brutal. After Vespasian became emperor himself, he left his son, Titus, to finish the job. In the year 70 AD, Titus and his legions laid siege to Jerusalem. The siege was long and horrific. The city was starved into submission. Finally, the Roman soldiers breached the walls. They fought their way to the Temple Mount. According to Josephus, who was an eyewitness to these events, Titus wanted to save the temple itself. But in the chaos and fury of the final assault, a Roman soldier threw a torch into one of the temple's inner chambers. The ancient dry wood caught fire instantly. The entire structure was consumed by an inferno. The gold melted and ran down between the stones. After the fire, to get every last bit of melted gold, the Roman soldiers used levers to pry the massive stones apart and topple them. Just as Jesus had predicted, not one stone was left on another. The symbol of Judaism was gone. And this all happened in 70 AD, within a single generation of when Jesus had spoken those words. The Western Wall, or Wailing Wall, that stands today is not part of the temple itself, but a retaining wall for the platform the temple was built on. The prophecy of total destruction was fulfilled with terrifying precision. This is often cited as one of the most powerful proofs of biblical prophecy. The prediction is specific, and its fulfillment is a well-documented historical event. But there is a major critical argument. It all comes down to the dating of the Gospels. Christian tradition holds that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses or their close associates well before the year 70 AD. If that's true, then it is a genuine prophecy. However, the majority of modern critical scholars believe the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written after the destruction of the temple, likely between 70 and 90 AD. They argue that the authors knew the temple had been destroyed, and they wrote that story back into the life of Jesus. It became another post-eventum prophecy, written after the fact to show that Jesus had divine knowledge. The debate over the dating of the Gospels is one of the most contentious issues in biblical scholarship. The case for this as a true prophecy rests almost entirely on whether you believe the Gospels were written before or after the year 70 AD. What we still don't know, can we ever definitively know when the Gospels were written? Were the authors simply recording history, or were they shaping the story of Jesus to make theological points for their own communities? And if Jesus did make the prediction before the event, was it a moment of divine foresight, or was he just a shrewd political observer who could see that the rising tension between the Jews and the Romans would inevitably lead to a catastrophic war? Number 3. Could a prophet see the fall of a great city to a man named Cyrus? The city of Babylon was the jewel of the ancient world, the capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. It was famous for its immense walls, its towering ziggurat, and its legendary hanging gardens. In the 6th century BCE, under King Nebuchadnezzar II, it was the most powerful city on earth. It seemed invincible, but the Hebrew Bible contains prophecies that not only predicted its downfall, but also named the man who would conquer it almost 150 years before he was born. The prophecies are found in the book of Isaiah. In chapter 44 and 45, the prophet Isaiah, who lived in the 8th century BCE, speaks the words of God. He delivers a stunningly specific prediction. He says that a ruler named Cyrus will be God's anointed one. This Cyrus will be a great conqueror who will subdue nations. The prophecy states that God will open doors before him so that gates will not be shut. It even says Cyrus will be the one to free the Jewish exiles who were held captive in Babylon and give the command to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This is an astonishingly detailed prophecy. It's not a vague warning of doom. It names the conqueror Cyrus. It describes the method of his conquest through open gates, and it outlines his future policy towards the Jewish people. At the time Isaiah was supposedly writing, Babylon wasn't even the dominant power in the region as Syria was. The Jewish people hadn't even been exiled to Babylon yet. Now let's look at history. In 539 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was ruled by Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar. The city of Babylon was protected by massive walls and the Euphrates River, which flowed through it. They felt secure. But the Persian Empire, led by its brilliant king, Cyrus the Great, was on the rise. Cyrus marched his army to Babylon. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus tells us what happened next. Cyrus's army diverted the flow of the Euphrates River into a basin, causing the water level in the channel running through the city to drop significantly. The Persian soldiers were then able to wade through the riverbed under the massive water gates and enter the city. The Babylonians were so confident in their outer defenses that they were in the middle of a festival and were taken completely by surprise. The gates were not shut, just as Isaiah had predicted. Cyrus took the city with very little bloodshed. And what about his policy towards the Jews? Shortly after his conquest, Cyrus issued a famous decree, recorded both in the Bible and on a historical artifact, known as the Cyrus Cylinder. In this decree, he allowed the peoples conquered by the Babylonians, including the Jews, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. He was seen as a liberator, a benevolent ruler. He fulfilled the prophecy to the letter. This seems like an open and shut case, but just like with the prophecy of the temple's destruction, there's a huge scholarly debate. It centers on the authorship of the book of Isaiah. The book is very long, and many scholars believe it was not written by a single person. They divide the book into at least 2, and sometimes 3 sections. Chapters 1 to 39 are attributed to the original Isaiah, who lived in the 8th century BCE. But chapters 40 to 55, the section that contains the detailed prophecies about Cyrus, are believed by these scholars to have been written by an anonymous author during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. They call this author Deutero-Isaiah, or Second Isaiah. If this theory is correct, then the author was writing when Cyrus was already a known political figure. He wasn't predicting the distant future. He was interpreting current events through a theological lens, seeing Cyrus's rise as part of God's plan. He was writing prophecy, but it was about something that was happening, not something that would happen 150 years later. The debate over the unity of the book of Isaiah is central to whether you see this as a miraculous prediction or a commentary on contemporary history written in a prophetic style. What we still don't know was the book of Isaiah written by one person over a long life or by multiple authors over several centuries. If it was a later author, was he simply recording what was happening, or did he still have some prophetic insight into how Cyrus's campaign would ultimately succeed? And does it diminish the power of the text if it's seen as a theological interpretation of history rather than a literal prediction of the future? Number 2, How could a 2,500-year-old prophecy describe a causeway in the sea? Of all the prophecies in the Bible, the one concerning the city of Tyre is perhaps the most graphically and literally fulfilled. Tyre, located in modern-day Lebanon, was an ancient and powerful Phoenician city-state. It was famous for its wealth, its purple dye, and its maritime trade. The city had two parts, a mainland settlement and an island fortress about half a mile offshore. The island was considered impregnable. It had massive walls, 150 feet high, that went right down to the sea. It had withstood many sieges. It was the ultimate coastal stronghold. Around 586 BCE, the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel delivered a devastating prophecy against the city. It's found in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 26. He spoke God's judgment against Tyre for its arrogance and for celebrating the downfall of Jerusalem. The prophecy is long and detailed, but it contains some incredibly specific and bizarre predictions. Ezekiel said that many nations would come against Tyre. He said the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, would build a siege wall against the mainland city, which he did, in a long but ultimately unsuccessful siege. But the prophecy goes further. It says that the stones, timber, and soil of the old city would be thrown into the midst of the water. It says that the city would be scraped bare, like the top of a rock. And most famously, it predicts that Tyre would become a place for the spreading of fishing nets. Finally, it says the city would never be rebuilt. For about 250 years, this prophecy seemed only partially true. Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the mainland city, but the island fortress remained powerful and independent. The idea of scraping the old city clean and throwing it into the sea seemed like a strange poetic metaphor. But then, in 332 BCE, a young Macedonian conqueror arrived. His name was Alexander the Great. Alexander needed to neutralize the Tyrian fleet, which was a threat to his campaigns. The island city refused to surrender. Alexander was faced with the problem of how to attack an impregnable island fortress. His solution was audacious, brutal, and a literal fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy. He decided to build a causeway, a land bridge, across the half-mile of sea to the island. And what did he use for building materials? He ordered his men to demolish the old ruined mainland city of Tyre. They took the stones, the timber, and even the soil and dust, and they threw it all into the sea to form the foundation of the causeway. The siege was an engineering marvel and a 7-month-long ordeal. The Tyrians fought back fiercely. But eventually the causeway reached the island wall. Alexander's siege towers rolled across, and his soldiers stormed the city. The carnage was immense. Thousands were killed, and the rest were sold into slavery. The city was left a ruin. Alexander had literally scraped the old city bare and thrown it into the water to attack the new one. And what about the fishing nets? Over time, silt built up against Alexander's causeway, turning the island into a peninsula, which it remains to this day. The once mighty city became a quieter, smaller settlement. For centuries, and even into the modern era, fishermen have used the flat, rocky shores of the ancient site to spread and dry their nets. The great commercial hub had become, just as Ezekiel predicted, a place for fishermen. As for never being rebuilt, while a city named Tyre exists today, the prophecy is often interpreted to mean that the original Phoenician city-state would never regain its former glory and power, which it never has. The skeptical argument here is more difficult than with other prophecies. The details are so specific and so strange. Or who would predict that a conqueror would throw an entire city into the ocean to build a road? The main critical argument is similar to the one about Isaiah questioning the date the text was written. However, there is much less scholarly debate about the 6th century origin of Ezekiel than there is about Isaiah. Most scholars accept that Ezekiel was a real prophet living during the Babylonian exile. Another argument is that Alexander might have been aware of the prophecy and deliberately fulfilled it. This is highly unlikely. Alexander was a Macedonian pagan, not a student of Hebrew scripture. His decision was based on pure military logistics. The fulfillment of this prophecy remains one of the most powerful and difficult to explain cases on record. What we still don't know was Ezekiel's vision a literal pre-play of Alexander's siege, or was it a poetic vision of destruction that Alexander's tactics happened to match by pure chance? Why were the details so specific and unusual compared to other biblical prophecies of doom? And is there any historical evidence that anyone in the ancient world, before Alexander, read this passage and wondered how on earth it could ever possibly come true? Number 1. What does it mean to see the future? We've traveled through history from ancient Greece to 20th century America. We've seen kings and conquerors, prophets and seers. We've looked at prophecies written in scripture, in cryptic poems, and in the folklore of a nation. Some seem like clever political tricks. Some feel like lucky guesses or statistical anomalies. Some rely on vague language and creative interpretation. But a few, like the destruction of Tyre or the curse of Tippecanoe, contain a level of specificity that is deeply unsettling. They challenge our modern, rational understanding of the world. So what does it all mean? What are we to make of these eerie echoes of the future found in the past? There are really only a few possibilities. The first is that it's all a grand illusion. It's a combination of vague predictions, post-eventum forgeries, cherry-picking the hits while ignoring the misses, and our own powerful human need to find patterns and meaning in a random universe. In this view, there is no such thing as seeing the future. There is only the creative interpretation of the past. This is the safest, most scientific view. And for many of the prophecies we've looked at, it's also the most likely explanation. The second possibility is that some people, through some unknown mechanism, have a genuine ability to perceive events that have not yet occurred. Perhaps it's a latent psychic ability, a different wiring of the human brain that can occasionally tap into information outside the normal flow of time. People like Edgar Cayce or the Brahman Seer might have been such individuals. This view challenges our understanding of consciousness and physics. It suggests that time may not be the linear, one-way street we experience it as. It suggests that the past, present, and future might coexist in some way that is accessible to certain minds. A third possibility, the one favored by religious traditions, is divine revelation. In this view, a prophet is not seeing the future on their own, but is acting as a channel, a messenger for a higher power, God, Apollo, the eternal sky that exists outside of time and knows the end from the beginning. The prophecies of Isaiah or Ezekiel would fall into this category. They are not human achievements, but divine messages, intended to prove the power and sovereignty of God. We are left with a mystery. Our logic tells us that time only moves forward. Our experience confirms it every second of every day, and yet these stories persist. They are footnotes in history books, whispers in folklore, and verses in holy texts that refuse to be easily dismissed. They act like a crack in the wall of our reality, a glimpse of something that shouldn't be possible. They force us to question the very nature of time, fate, and human potential. They remind us that for all our science and all our knowledge, there are still profound mysteries at the heart of the human experience. The question is not just, how did they know? The real question is, what does it mean that they might have known? What we still don't know is time strictly linear, or could it be a more complex dimension that our consciousness only perceives in one direction? If precognition is a real phenomenon, is it a skill that can be learned, or is it an innate and random ability? And if the future can be known, does that mean it is fixed and unchangeable, or do prophecies simply show us one possible path among many, a warning of what might be if we don't change course?